Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special meeting of All Rise, a UWGB Civil Liberties Lecture Series. My name is Nolan Bennett, and I am an assistant professor here and pre-law advisor in Democracy and Justice Studies. Along with Professor Elizabeth Weed, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And before I say anything else, on behalf of UWGB, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original first people of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nations communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. We acknowledge the First Nations people of Wisconsin. We'd also like to thank the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation, who have kindly sponsored this series. Their mission is to, quote, promote the study and discussion of civil liberties and related institutions and innovations through scholarly inquiry, educational activities, and community outreach. So again, thank you all for being here. Now, I know it's going to be hard to top tonight's speaker, but I do want you all to know that we will have one more meeting of the series in just 2 weeks on November 2nd. So please do look forward to more information on that event. And with that, let me turn things over to Professor Wheat to introduce our speaker for tonight.
All right, thank you very much. We are very excited to welcome Justice Karofsky here. Justice Karofsky was elected to the Wisconsin Supreme Court on April 7th, 2020, and took office a few months later in August. Before her election to the Supreme Court, Justice Karofsky served as a judge on the Dane County Circuit Court. And prior to becoming a judge, she was the executive director of the Office of Crime Victim Services for the State Department of Justice, previously served as an assistant state attorney general and Wisconsin's first violence against women resource prosecutor. Also an adjunct professor at the UW Law School, general counsel and director of education and human resources for the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and is an assistant district attorney and deputy district attorney for Dane County. Justice Karofsky has also served on a number of boards and committees, including the Governor's Council on Domestic Abuse, the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board, the Wisconsin Crime Victims Council, and the Dane County Big Brothers Big Sisters Board of Directors. Justice Karofsky earned her bachelor's degree from Duke University, master's degree from UW-Madison, and her law degree from UW Law School. Outside of the courtroom, Justice Karofsky is an ultramarathoner and has completed multiple marathons, ultramarathons, and Ironman competitions. Look forward to hearing from you tonight. And for our guests, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A, either during the talk or we'll have time for questions afterwards. And thank you very much and welcome back.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Nolan. And thanks for everyone who I can't see, but who I know is taking part in this conversation tonight. I'm really happy to be here. I'm honored to be here. You know, I'm always excited when people want to learn about the third branch of our government, right? I think there's understandably a lot of attention to the executive branch, and there's a lot of attention given to the legislative branch. And I think that because of that, some people, a lot of people don't understand how the judiciary works and the importance of the judicial branch. And we certainly have seen in the past few years the importance of the judiciary. If you think about the Dobbs decision that came from the US Supreme Court in June, if you think about the decisions that came down during the pandemic about masking and about where people could gather, if you think about cases that came down regarding the election and voting, you know, any big issue of our day right now is coming through our courts. And so I'm really glad that I have the opportunity to talk to you for a little bit tonight about my experience on the Wisconsin Supreme Court and talk to you a little bit about the judicial branch. I was asked to give a little bit about my bio. I think Elizabeth covered quite a bit of it. In 30 years, when I hear my bio, I think I had a hard time keeping a job is really what it sounds like to me. I've been really lucky in my career. I've had some just terrific jobs, and I've had a number of wonderful mentors along the way. I thought maybe what I would do is just talk a little bit about my career and talk about a little bit of what I learned, just broad strokes each step of the way. Just to back way up, I'm born and raised in Wisconsin. I was born in Middleton. And when I was growing up, my mom was mayor of Middleton. She was one of the first women mayors in the state of Wisconsin. And that's watching her be mayor of Wisconsin and campaigning with her in the early spring months of those years when she ran. I really thought that it really sparked in me the thought that I wanted to be in public service and the love of campaigning, to be quite honest. I graduated from high school in Middleton, and I went to Duke University. I was just talking to Nolan, who just had been down at Duke and had taught there for a while, and I got my political science and Spanish degrees there. I worked for a year in Washington, D.C. I went to law school, and right out of law school, I started working in the Dane County DA's office. I was one of about 30 DAs in that office, and what I learned in that office was, number one, the importance of common sense and the importance of being honest, how important my reputation was, the importance of integrity. And I learned how to handle really high volumes of cases. I prosecuted mostly cases of domestic violence, in cases of child abuse and child sexual assault. And the volume was super, super high. There would be some Monday mornings where I'd walk into court to pick a jury and I wouldn't know which one of my cases was going to go into trial. So I always had to be very, very prepared. I left there and I went to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and the National Conference of Bar Examiners is the organization that writes the bar exam for the whole country, and that has to be perfect. So what I learned in the DA's office was how to deal with high quantity, and what I learned at the National Conference of Bar Examiners was the importance of really, really quality work. I did develop a class at the UW Law School during that time called Victims in the Criminal Justice System, because I thought it was really important that people graduate from law school and they understand the criminal justice system from the defendant side, but that they also understood from the victim side, so that when people graduated, they'd be able to talk to defendants and they'd be able to talk to victims. I then went to the Wisconsin Department of Justice. I was hired as Wisconsin's very first violence against women resource prosecutor. I was an assistant attorney general, and I went all throughout the state and helped prosecutors prosecute their cases where women were victims of stalking and of strangulation and of domestic abuse and of sexual assault. And I think what I started to learn in that job was all about trauma and how trauma impacts really everyone, not just in the criminal justice system, but really everyone in the justice system, both victims and defendants. There's vicarious trauma for lawyers or victim witness staff. And I started to really gain an appreciation for that, how that impacted people in the system. I then went on to become the director of the Office of Crime Victim Services at the Department of Justice. So again, it was a statewide position. And I helped victims in all 72 counties of our state get the support that they needed as their case was winding its way through the criminal justice system. I think what I learned in that job was the importance of what I call creating a sacred space for people, creating a space for them to feel their feelings and for us to sit and to witness that and to let them have that space. And I started to learn what immense healing could come from that. In 2016, going into 2017, I ran for circuit court here in Dane County, and I won. I was a circuit court judge for 3 years. I sat on the criminal bench in Dane County, where again, I had to deal with really, really high volume, 1,700 cases a year were coming my way. I think it averages to about 5 new cases every single day. I was able to use all the lessons I had learned up until that point to try to achieve justice for people. I then ran for the Supreme Court and started in 2019. It ended, my election was in April of 2020. It was the first election held in the United States during COVID. It was an election where people had to decide for themselves whether or not they were going to go and vote, or they were going to stay home and not vote and keep their family and themselves safe. If you think back to what it was like in early April of 2020, we didn't have toilet paper, right? I mean, you couldn't find hand sanitizer. We knew nothing about the coronavirus at all, and people were really, really scared. Much to my surprise, and much to my delight, I won that election, and I learned a lot about what it was like to be a woman running for office, and I'm happy to talk about that a little more later if you'd like me to. I learned what it was like to have my kids put out there. My two kids are just absolute warriors and heroes. I learned what it was like to have to pivot in an election. And then I had to start a job during COVID. And for any of you who had a big change during COVID, that was really, really hard. My first year on the Supreme Court, all of our oral arguments were on Zoom. I didn't see any of my colleagues in person. All 7 of us on the Supreme Court were not together for my whole first year, which meant that the second year I was on the court, which was last year, it felt like a first year all over again. And I know that many of you can relate to that. I'm now in my 3rd year on the Supreme Court, and I feel like I'm figuring it out. I think you hear baseball players talk about when they're in the groove a little bit, that the ball, when they're at bat, the ball actually feels like it's moving a little slower towards them. I feel like the ball's moving just a little bit slower towards me. There's a lot that I am still learning every single day. I talk about being on the Supreme Court as truly being an honor, and a privilege and an honor. And I know that sounds cliche, but I really mean it. My office is in the state capitol, and I live only 3 miles from the state capitol. So I often just ride my bike on the bike path. Can actually get there faster on my bike than in the car. And when I get into the capitol, I walk up the main stairwell, and I walk 31 steps up, and at the top of the 31 steps is the governor's office and the attorney general's office. And then I walk another 32 steps up to the Supreme Court. And I always stop before I enter the Supreme Court hearing room. And I think about all the people who came before me. And I think about the important work that I need to do. And every time I walk into that Capitol and I walk up those 63 steps, I try to find something in the Capitol that I haven't seen before, because it is such an ornate, gorgeous building that I get to go in and work in every day. And then I go into my office, and sometimes we have oral arguments, and sometimes I'm just working on writing opinions with my clerk. Sometimes I'm just doing a lot of reading. But I go in there, and I learned when I was on the circuit court, before I would walk into my courtroom on the circuit court, I always thought to myself, I need to feel like I want my surgeon to feel before he or she walks into the operating room, or my pilot to feel before he or she walks into the cockpit. And before I walked into my circuit court, my courtroom when I was a circuit court judge, if I didn't feel that way, I stepped away and I went back to my chambers. And if I was hungry, I ate something. And if something had happened outside of the courtroom that I needed to tend to and I couldn't set aside, I would tend to it. And then I would go back in. I would make sure that I was in the right mental space to be able to do my job. And I do that at the Supreme Court too, because the stakes are so high on our court. I thought I would just take a minute and just talk about the court system just for a second. And then I was gonna just give you some observations about being on the Supreme Court. So in Wisconsin, we really have 4 levels of courts. The first level is the municipal court. And in municipal court, we have them in many areas of our state. And those are really for ordinance violations. So if any of you have ever gotten caught speeding, or maybe you've been caught because your dog didn't have a leash, or was at the dog park and you hadn't renewed your dog license, those things may or may not have happened to you. They may or may not have happened to me. But if it's something minor like that, you'll find yourself in municipal court. And the penalty of municipal court is usually just a fine. It always is just a fine. Sometimes they do restorative justice, but basically it's a fine. And the thing about municipal courts is that for many people, they're one and only touch point with the justice system. Municipal court judges in Wisconsin do not have to be lawyers, although many of them are lawyers, but you don't have to be. The next level is the circuit courts. And in Wisconsin, our circuit courts are county courts. There are a couple counties that have the one judge for 2 counties. They used to call them circuit courts because the like way back in the 1800s, the a judge and the defense attorney and the prosecuting attorney would all travel together in a circuit. If you read about Abraham Lincoln, when he was a lawyer, traveled all around Illinois with the judge and the defense attorney. They didn't have hotels back then. They would stay at these inns, and sometimes Abraham Lincoln would have to share a bed with the attorney he was arguing against all day. It's just amazing what these people had to do in the name of justice. So we have circuit courts here. They're generally by county. Some of them are one judge counties. In Dane County, we have 17 judges. In Milwaukee County, I think they have 47 or 48. And in Wisconsin, the circuit courts are courts of general jurisdiction, which means they hear just about everything, right? They hear family law cases, they hear juvenile cases, they hear criminal cases, they hear small claims cases, they hear cases if there's like a personal injury, if you get into a car accident, they hear cases about businesses, they hear cases about taxes. So they hear the wide range of disputes that need to be resolved in Wisconsin. Above the circuit court, if you don't like what happens in circuit court, you can appeal to the Court of Appeals. And in Wisconsin, we have 4 districts for our Court of Appeals. One is in Milwaukee because it's so big, they have their own. The next is the 2nd district, and that's over on the eastern side of the state. The 3rd district is up north, and then the 4th district starts in Dane County or Madison and goes all the way to the west over to La Crosse and over to the Mississippi River. The Court of Appeals will look at every case that is appealed to it, and they'll decide. They'll figure out, did the circuit court do the right thing? Did they not get it quite right? Are they going to ask the circuit court to do a do-over, or was everything just fine? And as far as they're concerned, the case was decided correctly. If someone doesn't like what happens at the Court of Appeals, the case comes to us, and it comes to us in the form of what we call a petition for review. We do not take every case that comes to us. It's one of the differences between us and the Court of Appeals, and that's the same thing with the United States Supreme Court. Once a month, we review, I think it's probably between 50 and 60 cases on average, and those are all the cases where people have asked us to take their case. We only take cases if there's an issue of law that hasn't been decided in this state, or if it's an issue of statewide importance. So we look really hard. What we don't do is correct an error that happened. And so we look really hard at which cases meet the criteria that we think which cases meet that criteria. And generally, I think we take about maybe 5 out of those 50 cases. I know last year we took approximately, last year we heard, I think 55 cases. So that's a little less than 5 a month. When we hear a case, it gets set for an oral argument. And so we will, before oral argument, the parties will submit their briefs, and we end up we can read thousands of pages in a week if we have a lot of oral arguments. When the parties come in for oral argument, there's an hour set aside, 30 minutes for each side. And I got to tell you, I think those lawyers who come in front of us and argue at oral arguments are super, super brave. They have to come in. We're sitting up on high on the bench. There's 7 of us. We're over caffeinated. I will tell you that right now. And these lawyers have to sit and argue their case in front of us as we're asking them question after question after question. After we hear an oral argument, usually we hear 2 in a day. And then in the afternoon, we spend our afternoon together trying to figure out how we're going to decide the case. And we go around a table, and our seats are assigned just like they are in the room where we hear the oral arguments, in our hearing room. And because I'm the most junior justice, I sit closest to the door, and it's my job every time someone knocks on the door to open the door. It's the same with the US Supreme Court. My colleagues did try to tell me when I started that I was supposed to buy them all coffee too, but I caught on to that really, really quickly. And people justices on the Supreme Court are always forgetting their glasses. So their clerks are always running their glasses into them. Or they, sometimes we forget a brief or something. And so our clerks will run that to us. So we go around the table and we talk about how we're going to decide a case. And then after we've all said, am I in affirm or reverse based on what the Court of Appeals does, we each have a poker chip, and mine's number 7 because I'm the least senior justice. They go 1 through 7. And all of our poker chips go into a green bedazzled St. Patty's Day derby hat. And the most senior justice then reaches into the hat and they pull out a poker chip. And if you're in the majority and your poker chip is pulled out, your job then is to write the opinion for the court. So that's the very, very scientific way that we do that. And they've been doing it that way for years and years and years. I've been told that the hat comes from Pat Crooks, that he brought in for St. Patrick's Day one day, and then they kept using it for that. So one of the things I just want to touch on, and I'm happy to take questions. Actually, there's two things. Number one, it was challenging for me when I got on the court to figure out what my job was when my colleagues and I were in conference. And I wasn't sure if my job was to try to convince my colleagues that I was right, which I did when I was a lawyer. I didn't know if my job was to just make a decision and to talk through my analysis like I did when I was on the circuit court. It really took me a while to figure out what it was. And then I finally realized sometime in my second year what my job was when all my colleagues and I are together. And my job is to be curious. My job is to be really, really curious and to try to understand how when my colleagues and I are looking at the same law and have the same set of facts in front of us, how is it that we can come out at two polar opposite conclusions? And so especially when I disagree with what one of my colleagues is saying, I double down on my curiosity. And I try to be really, really polite and say, I really want to understand what you're saying. Can you help me understand this point? Or I'd like to push back on this point or that point. Or I understand the first two things you said, but the third thing just isn't making sense to me. And I think by doing that, it's made me become a better justice, because I need to understand what people who don't agree with me, what their arguments are and what their position is and why they hold those positions. And I know that I've reached that place when I can say to one of my colleagues, I don't agree with you, but I understand. I understand how you got to point A to point B. And that is absolutely my job to do that. The last thing I want to say is this. We are at a pivotal time in our democracy. And I think that there are lots of people who are saying, what can I do about it? You can vote, and you have to vote. There is an election in a little over 2 weeks that is very, very important for the future of our state, for the future of our country, for the future of the world, to be quite honest. If you are not yet registered, figure out how to do it. Ask Nolan, ask Elizabeth, ask any of your professors, ask your fellow students, ask your RAs, get in touch with me. I have helped more people register to vote than I can possibly count. You also need a plan for voting. If you're able to vote in Green Bay, awesome, but think about what happens if you wake up on that Tuesday morning and you feel sick. I think figure out what your plan is going to be. Think about what your alternate plan is going to be. Make sure everyone around you is registered to vote and is going to vote, has a plan to vote. I can't emphasize enough how important it is. I think you have a duty, quite frankly, to do it. And I'm just going to encourage all of you to make sure that you, as citizens, that you are standing up to that duty. That's my dog. Sorry. I'm happy to take any questions or cover anything else that you wanted me to cover.
That was almost a perfect dog. I love that your dog it's like, okay, wrap it, like music at the Oscars or something.
Right, yeah. Our timing is never that good.
Thank you so much. So we have some questions already lined up here. So first, someone in the audience asks, what's one piece of advice you would give to your undergrad self?
One piece of advice I would give my undergrad self. No, I'm going to go back to just what I said, to keep being really curious about the world around me. I was lucky as an undergrad because I was in political science, and then I worked in Washington, D.C. between being in undergrad and law school. So I feel like I was, really, really interested in what was going on in the world. I think number one, to stay engaged. I think number two, to remain hopeful. I think sometimes it's hard. I think it's hard to do that. And I think that to try to understand that even if things aren't working out today, or things seem dire in a moment of history, that it doesn't always have to stay that way, and that we have to remain hopeful, and we have to figure out how we can be part of the solution.
Right, next question coming in. So thank you for a great presentation. And also, how have you seen the court change in Wisconsin over time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that. For one, I think the most obvious for anyone who walks into the Supreme Court chamber today in 2022 is when you walk into the chamber, you see that 6 out of 7 of the members of the Supreme Court are women. We have the highest percentage of women on any court in the United States. So that obviously is a really big change. I served with Ann Walsh Bradley, who was only the 2nd woman in Wisconsin to be on the Supreme Court. That statistic and that view that you see when you walk in, and I am told by many people, it is stark for them. It doesn't represent the judiciary in Wisconsin as a whole, and as a whole, Wisconsin is only has I think it's about 30, maybe 40% now. I was probably not as high as 40. It was in the 20s, and Governor Evers has appointed a lot of women. I'm not sure what the number is now, but it's not at 50%. So that's one way the court has changed. From time to time, the issues that we've dealt with have changed. Certainly since I've been on the court, we have had way more in my first 2 years. It hasn't been as much this year, but we had many more petitions for us to take a case as a original action, which means it doesn't start down in the circuit court and go through the Court of Appeals. It comes right to us. And we had a record number in the first 2 years I was on the court, which was last year and the year before. So that was a big change. It seems to be a little bit different this year, but we'll see with the election. I think a lot of that from the 2 years, the 2 previous years, were because of the pandemic and because of elections. I think in Wisconsin right now, we've got a bit of a stalemate because we've got Republican legislature and we've got a Democratic governor. And so a lot of big issues are coming to us instead of working their way through the legislative process, just because there's a stalemate there. A good example of that is the redistricting case from last year that came to us to handle because there was an impasse between the governor and the legislature.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a question of my own. I feel like recently most Americans, and at least my students, are more and more getting hip to the fact that the American Supreme Court is political, that it is influenced, whether it be the ideologies of the justices, the appointment process. And I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how politics influences someone in your position. The major difference being, as you noted, that yours is an elected position and not appointed. But what is the role of politics in terms of what's expected of you, ideology on the court, your relationship with other justices? How does that factor in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In Wisconsin, our judges are elected. And I personally think that's a good thing because, in one sense, it's a good thing because you travel all around the state and you listen to people when you're running for office, and you talk about you talk about why you want to run, and you hear what their view of the court is and what their concerns are as far as judges, and what they want to see in a judge or a justice. But you are running for office, and you do need to raise money. And in Wisconsin, we don't have a recusal rule, which is something I talked about quite a bit when I was running, where if you get if you get this money from these outside groups, you can still sit on their cases. There's nothing that tells you that you can't. And so I think that for many people, that they start to think about, well, then am I going to be able to get a fair shake up at the Supreme Court? I mean, that's the most important part of the legal system, is that our authority, the authority of the legal system, of the justice system, comes from people believing in the system, comes from people believing that we have authority. When we say this is what the law is, that's what we're doing. We're saying this is what the law is. Why would people follow that if they don't think that our institutions are legitimate? So you have to run for office, and running for office is inherently political. You're not allowed to run in Wisconsin as a Democrat or a Republican, but in recent years, people have run as liberals or conservatives, and they've run, and I don't know if that's a distinction without a difference or not. And so I think for many people, there's a distaste. Many people had a distaste for the kind of campaign that I ran. And I tried to leverage all the resources I could to win, because I think that the other side was doing the same thing. And I think, even when people are appointed, you look at the ads that were taken out for some of the most recent appointees to the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, people spent millions and millions of dollars trying to get, various Supreme Court justices appointed. And there's a lot of money behind that too. I don't know, I'm not saying any of the justices do feel beholden to those groups, but I think that it concerns people that that this outside money has come in, and I think people are concerned about what the impact of that is on the court system, understandably.
I think one thing that's been interesting to me, I followed the courts for a long time, sort of the nature of why I wanted to get into political science. But with the Dobbs decision this summer, I think we've seen such an unprecedented mobilization of a lot of people now waking up to just how much the courts affect their lives. And I think especially we saw with Kansas making the decision that they did on abortion. As you're seeing this, what are kind of your sense on the role of the courts when we're looking at some of these reproductive health rights that we have considered, I think, as established for quite some time? And Wisconsin now has its own policy on abortion. But how do you think the courts are going to be sort of entering and working in that space as we're seeing such a big shift?
So I'm going to be really careful here about answering this question, because I do think this is an issue that could come before us. And one of the things I need to make sure I'm doing, if you hear that loud slurping, that's my dog. Can you hear it? Okay, here. That's lucky, everybody. She's trying. She's only 2. So
She's coming in for the assist.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to be careful about talking about any issue or case that might come before us, because that would be unethical for me. And I'm not really sure how all of this is going to play out in Wisconsin or anywhere else. So even if I were to say, I would just be guessing. I do think, though, the point you made about people, it was an eye opener for people to see that the court had the power to take away rights. It harkens back to me the night before my 2020 election day, when both the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court told voters in Wisconsin that they were going to have to go to the polls and vote. So we had been trying the whole election to get people to care about the court, like care about the court. And it was really hard to get above the noise of COVID, understandably, once everything shut down March 10th or 11th or 12th. And then suddenly, the night before the election, people understood why the court was so important. People understood that the courts could make really, really big decisions that could impact all of us. So in a way, they made the case that we have been trying to make for us. And I think that the Dobbs decision is a good example of that. I think it's a good example of an instance where the court has taken away a right, and there aren't a lot of examples of that in U.S. history.
All right, we have another question from the audience here. So this audience member asks, have you had a case that's gotten to your level where a local landowner has accused maybe a mayor or a private developer company of unfair usage of eminent domain to seize their property? Has a case like that come before you?
Yeah, we've had a couple of eminent domain cases. I'm not sure we had one last year. We for sure had one my first year on the court. We may have had one last year too. They're sort of running together for me. But yeah, absolutely. And you know, the question is if the government is gonna, we actually did have one last year and I wrote it. If the government is going to you know, take part of your property, you deserve, you know, constitutionally to be compensated for it, justly compensated. So there's, you know, the issue is what's just you know, first of all, did the government take your property? Sometimes the case that I had involved an easement. So an easement, you know, are you just borrowing it? You're going to give it back. It was a temporary limited easement. And then if they did take your property, what is just compensation? How do you figure that out? So those cases can be very, very interesting.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, this is kind of more of a Supreme Court dynamics question as well. Do you think there's still a fair amount of collegiality and civility between the more liberal and conservative justices, despite our more polarized political environment?
On our court or the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yours, yeah.
On our court? Asking the question again, is there?
Basically speaking to the collegiality among the different
Oh,
ideological justices.
Yeah, I will tell you, you know, I can only speak for myself. I really appreciate the other 6 members of my court. I have learned so much from every single one of them, and I can go in order. You know, Ann Walsh Bradley has been on the court the longest. She has been on the court since 1995. I graduated from law school in 1992. So for most of my legal career, this woman has been on the court. I pinch myself every time I get to work with her, or every time she asks me a question, or, you know, every time she comes into my office or asks me to go for a walk or whatever. I mean, she is just a great colleague. She is really, really good. She sets an intention every day, and she thinks about what she's it's a gratitude. She talks about her gratitude journal every day. I'm gonna get one more bone. I'm sorry, hold on.
For our audience, we were sharing tricks of how we keep our pets occupied during meetings like this. I personally go with the Chunola approach. So if you do have meetings, which is what the justice is doing as well, you always have to have a backup to keep your pets occupied. So this is a Zoom lesson for our entire audience.
The frozen bison bone is what I went with. So that's Justice Ann Walsh Bradley. I have a colleague crush on her, to be quite honest. I can't believe that I get to work with her, someone who I've looked up to literally my entire career. Next in seniority is Pat Rogensack. Justice Rogensack is retiring at the end of this term. Justice Rogensack, she and I are the only 2 justices who actually live in Madison. She is such a hard worker. And she is just, I think she gets to the office at the same time every day. I think she's got this like amazing routine and discipline. And I really, really admire that about her. The next in seniority is our Chief Justice, who is Annette Ziegler. And, you know, Chief Justice Ziegler has, I think, just done a really good job of a lot of outreach. People come up to me and talk about, she has to go to all kinds of different events. And people always talk to me about how personable she is when she is out and about at these various events. And I think she makes the court feel very accessible, which in my mind is really, really important. She had years as a circuit court judge in Washington County, and a lot of times in our cases, she brings in that experience, which for me is very, very helpful. And I really, really appreciate that. Rebecca Bradley is the next in seniority. And Rebecca Bradley had worked in private practice and had experience dealing with insurance law and tax law and all kinds of parts of area of the law that I never practiced in. And so I always really, really appreciated in a case where she'll step back for a minute and explain a bigger picture about how she's seeing a case based on her experience. Justice Rebecca Dallett is next in seniority. I'm probably closer friends with her than I am with other justices on the court. This woman has more energy than any human being should. She's been just so helpful to me as I started my career on the court, helped me getting clerks and helped me understanding the culture and what we do after this. And I always say to her, I don't know how she started as a Supreme Court justice without a Becky Dallett to help her start. And then there's Brian Hagedorn, who's the only man on the court. Brian and I, because we have assigned seats in the conference room, we sit next to each other. I like to say we're at the little kids' end of the table, which is funny, right? Because Brian is like 6'2" or 6'3", and everyone else isn't nearly that tall. So we sit at the end and we share a drawer that I'm constantly pulling out and hitting his knees because he's so tall. But I appreciate Brian's sense of humor. He was at the Department of Justice when I was there, so we knew each other back then. But I very, very much appreciate his sense of humor. I really like the way Brian Justice Hagedorn writes. I think he writes in a really, really clear style too. So, and from my perspective, as far as the collegiality, I really try to think about the things I really appreciate about my colleagues. And any one of them can disagree with me on any case, and that's just the way it goes. I try never to take that personally. Like I said, I try to be curious about that and understand why they disagree with me. Not like, how could you possibly disagree with me, but why, why, how is it that you see it differently?
So my next question touches on your really tremendous history of work on domestic violence and abuse. So as you know, the United States has a long and still very recent history of providing particularly bad legal protections for Indigenous women facing violence, especially in cases where the violence is perpetrated by a non-member or not a member of the tribe. I would just be curious to hear you talk a little bit about what the state of protections are like for Indigenous women in Wisconsin, and maybe where we could do better or where you hope things will improve in the future.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit, so I worked on a lot of these issues. The last time would have been 2016 before I took the bench. So everything I'm going to say is dated just by the experience I've had. I do know that the Department of Justice has really made a big effort, and that the Wisconsin Department of Justice has really made a big effort in the past few years to address the issue, especially of women in Indigenous communities throughout our state. Look, for anyone who is on the margins, and I gotta say, like, as women, we kind of start there. You are at a greater risk for if you are the victim of a crime or threatened with a crime. You're just at a greater risk of not achieving justice. And a lot of the work that I did as the head of the Office of Crime Victim Services is to try to increase the number of people we had in the state able to give support to victims in all corners of the state. And it's a really, really big state. The good news, I think, is that this is on people's radar more than it has been. But my sense is that there is a lot, and there's always more work that needs to be done. Acknowledging it is the first step, and then figuring out how you're going to get resources and what those resources are going to do is absolutely the next step. And making sure people know where to report and that they're going to be safe once they do report. And then, how do you hold the perpetrators accountable? How do you do that in a fair way? Well, all of that is very, very complicated.
We have an audience member asking about when you, and I'll add a bit to this as well, when you ran for office, did it feel less partisan than more of a overtly partisan race, like being governor or running for Senate? And then if you could also speak to what it was like being a woman running for office as well.
Sure. The thing about running for Supreme Court or running for Circuit Court, like I did in 2017, is those elections are in April, so they're in the nonpartisan elections, and I think and they just, because of that, I think, and maybe the time of year, and because of the offices that people are running for, they don't tend to get as much attention. So, and there's not as much money that comes in. In my race total, there was, I think we spent $10 million, and it was the most expensive Supreme Court race up to that time. And that's nothing compared to the amount of money that's being spent in the governor's and the Senate races right now in Wisconsin. So they tend to be quieter. They tend to be lower key. You can't take the politics out of it, not right now. And I think part of it was the Citizens United decision. I think part of it, like I talked about, is the recusal rule that we don't have in Wisconsin. And so it's really hard to take the politics out of it and to get your message across. I think it's really important. And one of the things that I try to do all through my election is to say, look, these are my values. These are the things I believe. But when I put my robe on, I follow the law, and I can give example after example after example where I have ruled against what my personal beliefs are, which is hard. And it's really, really hard to do. As far as running as a woman, it's super difficult. It's really, really hard. I mean, first of all, I ran not just as a woman, but as a single mom, and there aren't a lot of single moms who have run for statewide office. Everything gets criticized: your hair, your clothes, your voice, your makeup, your lack of makeup, your shoes. If you can't be too forceful, but you have to be forceful enough. All you're doing is threading needles all day, every day. And at some point I just stopped looking at it. I felt like my campaign did a really good job on letting me focus on the things about me that were important to me. I talked every single time about being a single mom. I talked about the issues that were important to my kids and me. I talked a lot about, my ability to run super long distances for days on end. And they let me do that. And that made it a lot better for me because I was able to be authentic to myself. But, I got asked all the time, like, what about your kids? How are your kids doing? My opponent had 5 kids, and he never, ever, ever got asked that question. I never heard him be asked questions about like the tie he was wearing or the color of like suit jacket he was wearing. It just doesn't happen. And so it's really, really challenging. And they say that most women need to be asked, I think, 7 times to run for office before they'll run. I hear people talk about they're afraid women talk about they don't want to run for office because they're afraid of how it will impact their kids. I just don't really hear a lot of men saying that. And the flip side of it is that when you're a woman running, you get to talk about being a mom. You get to talk about what it's like to all the mom things, which really resonate. And I talked a lot about being a single mom. And after almost every speech I gave, after I talked about being a single mom, there was someone from the audience, a woman from the audience, who came up and gave me a big hug and said, I don't know how you're doing it, but it means so much for me to see you doing it and to hear you talking about it.
Thank you. That's amazing. I love hearing that. So another question from the audience here, kind of a 2-parter, but they're related. 1, what kind of cases do you get in the Supreme Court most often? And then 2, what's your favorite type of case to get?
That's a good question. So in the petitions for review, when we're reviewing cases, most of them are criminal, but we end up taking a lower percentage of those. So I think I'd have to go and look, but I'm pretty sure we take more civil cases than criminal cases. And out of those civil cases, I would just be sheerly guessing if I tried to guess like what issue we heard the most of, whether it was, we don't hear a lot of family cases. I think we've only heard 1, but I think that's how it would work out. We hear more, we actually take more civil than criminal cases. I'm completely blanking on the second part of the question. Oh, what's my favorite type of case? That's a really good question. The criminal cases for me are, I can review them a little quicker because I have so much background in criminal law, and a lot of issues that will come before us are issues that I've at least grappled with in one way or another usually. We've had a couple of interesting cases that have impacted victims, and I like those because I feel like as I look to my colleagues when they have an area of expertise, I feel like in those cases sometimes they'll look to me, and I'm able to maybe give a perspective that they may not have had before. But I do like learning new things, and so when we do hear a case about taxes that sometimes might seem sort of boring, when you get into the weeds, it can actually be a little bit interesting. Sometimes it can be very interesting, but it's the first case that I wrote was a trademark issue, and I had never done anything in trademark law, and so I had to learn all of it because I had to write the case. I had to figure out what the law is, and then write the opinion based on that.
So next one, very different topic, but I think fascinating to hear your thoughts on. Student says, I'm not an American citizen, but I seek advice nonetheless. What would you recommend for a country trying to build a judicial system from scratch? And for context, the student is studying here, and they are from Belarus. Okay,
well, welcome. That's a great question. And I've spoken a little bit on some panels about through the State Department, around elections. So when we're thinking about, when you're talking about setting up a democracy or setting up a legal system, and nothing is more important than the rule of law, right? So what is your law going to be? What are your laws going to be? Here, obviously, in the United States, we started with the Constitution and then the amendments to the Constitution, and then we talk about the statutes that were developed and the case law that was developed. And so and that really is the foundation of this country is, what is the rule of law and how are we going to follow that? We talk about being a country of laws and not of men or women, I would add. And that is the foundational principle of a justice system in a democracy, that we're going to have these laws and everyone's going to know what they are, and we're going to abide by them, and we're going to look to judges and the judiciary and justices to interpret the laws so they can tell everyone how they should be interpreted. And it sounds so simple, and yet it's so incredibly complex.
All right. So the last week, I like to finish these up, although it was a very, not a super deep traumatic question, very interesting, but we kind of like to finish on this game we have yet to come up with a good name with, basically just a popcorn game. So Nolan and I will alternate, ask you questions, not like deep thoughts, just initial reaction kinds of things.
Awesome. So, I love these.
I will start.
Bring it.
So when you go to the dog park, who are Lucky's friends? Big dogs, little dogs, or anybody?
People, first and foremost, people. She loves people. She loves little dogs. She'll get down on her back and let little dogs roll over. And she usually looks for dogs about her size that seem to be her age. And she finds them, but like jumping up and down and seeing if they'll jump up and down correspondingly. And then she'll wrestle with them.
All right. Favorite obscure legal term?
Favorite obscure legal term? Wow, that's really hard. I'd say ipsy dixit, which means it just is because I said it is, so therefore it is.
Duke versus UW-Madison in basketball.
Oh boy, I went to that game and I wore my Duke shirt all the time. Every step. Sorry. I went. No, the Duke basketball is a religion. If you went to undergrad there.
I went to IU, so I maintain the IU loyalty as well there.
You understand, yeah. And other sports, I really don't care. Like they played each other in football, I really wouldn't care. But basketball, it's just, which blows like the minds of many people around me. But I was in Indiana when Duke beat the Badgers. I'm still hoarse.
I had exactly that question, but I'm coming up with a different one, though it's similar. Wisconsin bratwurst or Carolina barbecue?
Ooh. So I don't eat meat. So I'd have to do a Wisconsin not dog or Carolina, like, what is it? Impossible They're both, yeah, they're just, neither one's gonna cut it, man.
Collards, you know.
Yeah, the food, I like the food in North Carolina.
Really can't, it's hard to top that barbecue. Favorite Halloween costume, either for you or for your dog?
Oh, wow. I've been watching I saw some funny ones my kids sent me, like on TikTok or YouTube. The ones where like they have a dog dressed up like another animal are hilarious. I saw one with like a dog dressed up as like a panda. There's like 3 or 4 dogs dressed up as like pandas or something, and those just kind of blow my mind. So I'm gonna have to go with some crazy lucky costume.
We've gone with the unicorn for one of mine, so it's me.
Oh yeah, that's actually a really, really good idea. Yeah. I don't know if she'd let me dress her up, but maybe this year I'll try.
All right, favorite part of an Ironman competition?
Oh, the run. I'm a runner, and so the swim is all about survival for me, like literally. Just trying not to freak out and just staying calm in the water, and then try not to get like kicked in the face over and over again. I really like riding my bike, but I'm not a bike racer, and so that's just endurance and just being out there for me. It's like 7 hours, but the run, I could actually pass people if I felt good, and you're getting to the end, and you end with the run, right? So you're running across the finish line. So yeah, it's all about the run for me.
Last one for me, and then Nolan will have one more to wrap us up. Since it's a Wisconsin traditional dish, favorite flavor of Kringle?
Oh boy, I'm gonna go with the cheese. I really like the cheese Kringle. Although, yeah, I'm gonna go with the cheese. It's hard because I like the raspberry too, but cheese.
All right, and you are on a desert island, and you can bring one book. What is that book?
100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Oh,
my favorite book.
Yeah, that's a great one. I thank everyone for joining us tonight, and definitely want to echo where we started about the importance of getting registered to vote. We've got a big election in a few weeks. If you are voting on campus, you will see me there as one of your poll workers. So I also have lots of I voted stickers, so don't feel left out if you voted early, which you can do down at City Hall. So definitely get a plan. We've got a lot of good information. You can reach out to any of us for questions, and we are more than happy to help. Wisconsin's in a really important position for this election, and it's a big one. So we are happy to support, and I appreciate the Go Vote shout out for that as well. So thank you so much for joining us again, and thank you to all of our presenters, and we hope to see you in a few weeks for our final All Rise of the semester. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks for having me here.